Well, I feel like you.
So my name is Emily Wicks, and I am the director of the Chouteau County Library System. I would like to welcome everyone tonight. Thank you for locals who have come out. Thank you for folks from out of the area who have come out. I wasn't sure what to expect for tonight. I've been following Chris on social media, and he's been very busy. And so I am very, very pleased that we are able to have him here with us tonight. So this is Chris Latray, a Métis storyteller, author, newly released book. They have some books. We have his books upstairs for checkout also. So let's get right to it. Please welcome Chris Latray.
Well, bonjour. Bonjour, anyway, Chris Kashin. That is hello, all of my relatives in Anishinaabe, which is the language of my people. I'm enrolled with the Little Shell Chippewa tribe. We're Anishinaabe. We speak Anishinaabe, which is the same as Ojibwe Moan or Ojibwe or Chippewa. Those are all different words for the same thing. I also said you can call me Chris in Michif, which is the other language of my people, a language that I guarantee was regularly spoken up and down these streets back in the day when Fort Benton was booming. And people were shooting at each other and stabbing each other and disappearing bodies in the river, all the golden days, right? I have a deep family connection to this place, which maybe I'll talk about if I remember a little later. I'm also the Montana State Poet Laureate currently, and I will hold that post for almost another year. But I don't really intend to recite or read any poetry today, but if we have time for that, and anybody wants to hear one, might consider it. I'm here mostly behind this book, Becoming Little Shell, which just came out about a month and a half ago on Milkweed Editions. It's the story of the Little Shell tribe and who the Métis people are and my family's connection to it. So the way I usually do these things is I like to read kind of a condensed version of the introduction because it does a good job, I think, of kind of setting the tone for what the book is about and my approach to it. And then I'll talk a little bit, but what I would really like to do as quickly as possible is get to questions. Because a book like this, the whole point of it is to help people learn a little bit about who we are and our experiences. And the best way we learn is through interaction with each other and asking questions. And that's the part that makes doing these things really enjoyable to me. Not reading the same thing over and over again. It's the different interactions I have with people who have shared experiences, even if your background is different. Many of the stories and the hardships that we face as Little Shell people, as Métis people, overlap into other cultures and other peoples and other diasporas and things like that. So without further ado, I will read this introduction. It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes, I-90 east-west, 93 north-south, are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam roots. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers. Same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are others too, Indian names all in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum kitchen floor of our little farmhouse in Tucson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked, when asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latreille, sitting at the table, asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. Excuse me. Wasn't until my grandfather died just shy of 83 years of age in late September 1996 that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle and working a job that required a long traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sun was bright, the foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather. Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When he exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So, what did you think about all those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any Indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was Native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latreilles in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I can recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his Indigenous heritage and, through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way, in most contexts, bordered on fighting words. If pressed, his calmest response was to refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. No, who we are, where we come from. I'm certain he had to answer to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own. If not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family heritage, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along, a proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana. Because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger Indigenous family. Like the stories of all Indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. It is also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever seen. It is a story still unfolding. So that's my condensed introduction. Basically sets the framework for why did my father deny his Indigenous heritage, and who are the Little Shell, and who are the Métis people. So that's the core of what the book is about. And also how I took the path to getting enrolled with the Little Shell tribe and learning all this stuff and where my family came from. These people who were a mystery to me my whole life. And one of the great kind of results of this book coming out is I'm having people come up to me all the time who are cousins because we share ancestor, Mose and Susie Latreille, who are a part of a group of 20 Métis families who founded what is today the town of Lewistown. And starting in the late 1860s, they were on the Milk River, just north of here. And they were burned out of there by the US Army twice. And finally, in the spring of 1879, they were given an ultimatum. You need to move or be removed. So this group of 20 families came down, crossed the Missouri at Fort Benton, and then followed it down to the Judith Basin and down to Big Spring Creek, which is where Lewistown is now. And they started a community there. And Mose and Susie were part of that 20 families. And they were good Catholic people with a very Catholic love for each other. And they cranked out about 13 kids. And from those 13 kids came so many grandkids. And from those grandkids came so many great-great-grandkids. So when my dad said that we weren't related to any of the other Latreilles, he was not entirely accurate, because we are all of the Latreilles are related. And my grandmother was a Donnie. And it's between the Azures and the Donnie as to who has the most members carrying that family name, kind of in the Little Shell Métis community. Mose made a living for a long time as a woodhawk on the Missouri River. Do we know what a woodhawk is? Anybody? They cut wood for the steamboats coming up the river. So there's actually two versions of woodhawks. If my friend Al Wiseman from Chouteau, who is one of our most treasured elders, was here, he would talk about how the Métis people who lived up in the Teton Canyon up above Chouteau, their version of woodhawk was cutting fence poles and cabin posts and things like that for the settlers that were coming in, and that's how they made their living, as woodhawks for homesteaders. My grandfather was woodhawk on the Missouri. They would cut wood and pile it on the banks of the Missouri, and the steamboats would come up and load that wood up, so that, because it took lots and lots of fuel to chug their way up to Fort Benton, which was as high as they could get on the Missouri. A great story I heard from another one of my Métis relatives, Dr. Rosalind Lapierre. She's enrolled Blackfeet, but she's Métis. I can't remember if it's her mother's side or her father's side. Talks about how one of the big conflicts in these latter years with the Blackfeet people was with the woodhawks. Because what was the form of tree that was most typically growing along the Missouri? Cottonwoods, yes. The Blackfeet for centuries interred their dead in the cottonwoods or among the cottonwoods. And the cottonwoods they viewed as their relatives, because those bodies on their frames would decompose and they would fall down onto the soil. And those remains would then get emerged into the soil and then pulled back up into the cottonwoods. So the Blackfeet DNA was a part of the DNA of of the cottonwoods. So an assault on those trees was an assault on their ancestors. So that was one of those unforeseen conflicts that we can't really understand because we didn't live it. Mose was often in Fort Benton looking for work for the different people who he would sign on to Woodhawk for, or he was also a Red River cart driver for a while, and that means he had a train of these Red River carts that he would trade back and forth between over the Medicine Line and back, the Medicine Line being the border with Canada. And it was at one point when Mose was in Fort Benton and Susie was 100 miles downriver and one of their children died. And Susie was very Catholic. So she brought with her 2 daughters and her deceased son, and alone they came all the way up to Missouri to Fort Benton, which was at the time a very, very dangerous undertaking because she wanted that infant to be buried in hallowed ground. And that was the closest place that there was a Catholic church or a Catholic cemetery. And I'm wondering if somewhere, well, certainly this relative of mine, this great relative of mine, is buried here somewhere. So that's what I mean about having this deep family history, and I'm not alone in it. You know, the Métis, the reason we were burned off the Milk River, because the rest of the folks who didn't leave when those 20 families did, 6 months later did get burned off. It was the second time it happened, where the army came, drove everybody out, burned down their communities, the whole bit, scorched earth. The reason for this is, you know, in the late 1870s, you know, what had just happened in central Montana, back-to-back things. 1876, Custer gets what's coming to him. What happened in 1878? The Nez Perce almost made it to Canada. So central Montana was this boiling point of cultures slamming together, and buffalo cultures like ours, the Métis, those 20 families were buffalo hunters. That's why we ended up in the Lewistown area, because that part of Montana was one of the last places you could still subsistence hunt buffalo on the plains. We think of that as ancient history, but that's my great-great-grandparents. That's not very long ago. And that's why they were there. There was this crux where you had people in that community who wanted to live traditionally, and then you had people who were recognizing that times were changing and that we needed to evolve into something different if we wanted to survive. And we weren't the only ones. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Nakota, the Ani, all of us in the same area scrambling for the same resources, along with all of these other cultures and peoples from all around the world coming here for all the reasons that people came up to Missouri. Land, gold, everything that brought people to this part of the world. We think of this as black and white. One of my favorite jokes I like to make is like what a bar in Fort Benton would have sounded like. Who's seen Star Wars? Remember the bar scene in Star Wars? And you have all these different people and different cultures and different languages, and people are stabbing each other over here and they're buying each other drinks over there, and these guys are making a legitimate trade deal, and these people over here are making an illegitimate trade deal. That's Star Wars, and that's Fort Benton. I bet you Lucas like copied Fort Benton. We should sue him. Where's your Chamber of Commerce people? That's what it was like here. All of these cultures coming together, and who lost? The people who were here first. If you look around and look at who owns the land and all that stuff, it's not us. We became the landless Indians of Montana because everything that we had was taken from us, beginning about the 1850s and culminating in 1892. And that's when our chief Little Shell at the time he was the third hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa. The Pembina Chippewa are who the Little Shell come from, who the Turtle Mountain Chippewa come from, who the vast majority of the Chippewa people on Rocky Boy came from, who the vast majority of Chippewa people of who comprise the Manitoba Métis Federation come from. We were one nation called the Pembina Band, and we were kind of the southwestern edge of the Ojibwe Anishinaabe nation, which I define as nation by all these different tribes. Because we think of the Ojibwe as living around the Great Lakes, and we were on the western edge of that, and we became buffalo hunters because that was where our food source was. And we invented the Red River cart, which is considered the first evidence of wheel use by Indigenous people on the northern plains We invented the Red River cart because we would take those things out 10, 20, 50, a couple hundred, 1,000 at a time to hunt buffalo. And we'd bring back hides, and we'd bring back pemmican. We were, for 50 to 100 years, the most powerful economic organization on the Northern Plains. That includes the Canadians, that includes the Americans, and it includes every single other tribe. The Métis were it. And you never hear about us. We are a indigenous culture, unique indigenous culture recognized in Canada, but not the United States. But we're the same people. And I already said it once, I'll say it again. We didn't cross the border crossed us. And it's for political reasons, I believe, that the United States chooses not to recognize us. Because there's a lot to reckon with in what they took from us if they recognize us. It's very easy to say, well, you're not Métis, you're Cree, you're Canadian. That means you should be over there anyway. And that's what they did to us in 1896, is they said, any of you people who are not on reservations are Cree Indians, and we're gonna round you up and deport you to Canada. And that's what they did. And we just kept coming back. And so we ended up living on these fringe communities, and over 100 years, we made a case, we sent people to DC. Different groups were lobbying to have land set aside for the landless Indians. Think about that for a second. The idea that any indigenous people anywhere can be landless. What does that say about the society you're living in? And then in 1978, the United States passed a bunch of legislation related to Native people, like the Indian Religious Act or whatever it's called, because we couldn't practice our traditional ceremonies until 1978. I had a stack of Kiss albums already in 1978. And along with that was the United States made a plan or a path for unrecognized tribes, unfederally recognized tribes to become federally recognized. And that's when we consolidated under the name Little Shell in honor of the chief who was in charge when we lost everything, and began those processes that finally culminated in December of 2019 with our federal not recognition restoration. Restored in the eyes of the federal government because we already knew who we were. And since then, we've added a couple thousand enrolled members to the Little Shell tribe. We've done all of these wonderful things in the Great Falls community. And our star is rising. I was doing a book event. I've been all over the country. I've been in 9 states for this book so far. And I'm gonna hit 3 more in a couple weeks. And I was in North Carolina, and members of the Lumpy tribe came out and they said, we're here because we have heard about the Little Shell and we admire you and we want to be like you guys. Because they have their own very conflicted relationship with the federal government. So the Little Shell are important. We've always been important. And if there's any one takeaway I want people to have reading my book, is the pride I have to be who I am that my father never had. Someone asked me in a Q&A one time, what would you want your dad to take from this book? And I said, pride. And since he can't, I'm gonna be proud enough for the book. So I would love to answer any questions now, if anybody has any. Don't be shy. Yes.
Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Frenchtown. Frenchtown, you know where that is?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I forget where I am. I could be in like Pennsylvania right now. I'm not asking people where they know where Frenchtown is, because I see Grizz stuff everywhere too. So Frenchtown, I grew up, I say I live in Frenchtown now. I have a Missoula address, but all the kids in my neighborhood go to Frenchtown, so that's Frenchtown as far as I'm concerned. And from my front porch, I can see the remains of the paper mill that my dad worked at for 43 years. And what I didn't know, and one of the things I learned, is that Frenchtown was a Red River Métis resettlement zone going back to the late 1850s. Thomas Marr passed through there and wrote about the community it was. And some people think it's certainly one of the oldest still current communities in Montana. But it was founded by people who from the Red River who originally went to Washington. And then Stevens goes out there and starts messing with the Indians, and they rise up. He declares martial law, and they're like, we don't want any part of this, and move to what is now Frenchtown, Montana, and restarted their community. And I grew up with a bunch of families with old Métis names, Cyr, Lucier, Deschamps, Lavoie, LaSalle, all these old Métis names going back to the days when Chicago and Green Bay and places like that were trading posts. And they moved west and stayed out here. We were all culturally related, but none of us knew. And why didn't we know? Because the ones who knew, our elders weren't talking about it. Because if you could pass as white as early as the 1850s, you did. So there's all kinds of achievements that are handed off to the French Canadians and the French trappers, and they were sitting in their trading posts counting their money. We were the ones out doing the work, the Métis. So Frenchtown was a Métis community. Does that answer the question? My dad was born in Lewistown, as was his dad, and my grandmother was born in Roy. So that's when I talk about like where our family story starts in Montana, it's Lewistown.
Chris, as you went around Montana seeking out your father's story and therefore your story, what was the biggest surprise to you that you found along the way?
I think the biggest surprise that I found, and I share with my friend Elisa sitting here, is like those 20 families that founded Lewistown were like Métis royalty. So the Métis community were comprised of these buffalo brigades. And that's what made us so good at it, is the military-esque organization of our buffalo hunting operations. And I've since learned through historians and scholars in Canada that group of families, they were a group for a specific reason. You know, and Elisa, you're a descendant of the leaders of that organization, right? And same with my grandma. I mean, these were important people for the community that they came from. And why I don't like, I mean, that sounds borderline hierarchical, and I don't mean it to. It comes to that pride thing. You know, we weren't a bunch of drunk, useless, can't hold job Indians living outside of communities. We were people who did what we had to survive when everything that we had been prior fell to the earth. And they sacrificed mightily so that we could be here to talk about where we come from. And I take that very seriously, because who wouldn't do what you have to do to survive? And those who don't survive. And I'm a product of that, and I'm very proud of that. Knowing where we come from and who we are. Yes.
When you talked about the way the tribes are connected, so would it be accurate to say all Métis are Ojibwe, but not vice versa? Like Métis are an offshoot of the nation? Or are they kind of a mix of different tribes that came together to do the buffalo hunting?
So the Métis, and in Canada right now, there's a lot of squabbling as to who is really Métis. So Métis, the word literally means mixed in French. So lowercase m, Métis means mixed. But if you see it uppercase M, Métis, it means a specific culture. And as Red River Métis, there's nobody who denies that we aren't true Métis. And what the Métis are, we are an indigenous cultural group who rose to prominence after contact with Europeans. So this starts in the late 1600s when the Hudson's Bay Company charter is granted to these two guys who start the Hudson's Bay Company. That's like 1670 something, yeah. And this is an area called Rupert's Land, which comprises a third of what Canada is today. And this Rupert, Prince Rupert, who gives them the charter, basically allows the Hudson's Bay Company to run this country-sized piece of land like a country. So it's like if Walmart all of a sudden could run a third of Montana or a third of the United States. It was like that. This trading group is in charge. Well, the first people to come to our region, the Red River Valley, the Red River settlement is now Winnipeg, Manitoba. That's where they first came together. The first ones to show up are the voyageurs, who are the legendary traders and travelers of the North in their birch bark canoes that were 40 feet long, and the weight they could carry and the distances they would travel. They're legendary. So they show up in these communities to establish these trading posts. And the natives won't trade with them. We're talking Ojibwe people and Cree people and the farther west, the Dakota, which we know of as the Assiniboine people, would not trade with them unless they were family. So to get around that, the same way that the tribes themselves have gotten around it is you marry into each other's families. So that those first European traders married into indigenous families through marriage with women. And this wasn't something that was forced upon those women. They had agency and they recognized what benefit trade with these strangers could bring to their families. They would increase the wealth and power of their own families and the good of their communities. And it went on like that for several generations. And the offshoot of those marriages are those first mixed race people who come to be known as the Métis, whose cultural flag flies before the Canadian flag does. So what the Métis are is this blend of cultures. I call us the perfect North Americans. Because in North America, we are still just this mix. But for a long time, it wasn't shitty. You know, there wasn't anybody trying to power over anybody else. We took the best that we could get from religion. So we incorporated Catholicism initially, not instead of, but along with our native spirituality and culture. We combined the music of the fiddle with the drumming of our indigenous stuff and the dancing, the jig dance combined with traditional, what we might know of, you know, some are older than others, and a lot of our traditional indigenous dances are relatively new, but all of those things, fashion, you know, we were the beaded flower people because we would always decorate our clothing, but when the Europeans start bringing glass beads and things, all of a sudden we have this rich, identifiable cultural practice of beading everything. Our clothes, our saddles and saddle blankets and bags and all of this stuff. And that spreads throughout North America and gets incorporated by other tribes. So that mixture, we aren't, you know, my tribal ID says I'm Chippewa Cree, which I am, it's part of who I am, but it should say Métis. And the reason it doesn't is because we're not recognized. But we are a mix, we are the best of everything. And we did that for a long time, and to me, it tells me that we could be that again if we would set aside all the trivial garbage that we let kind of drive wedges into our communities. We have so much more in common than we do. Yes.
Sorry, question. So, tomorrow we're gonna visit one of the buffalo jumps, around the state. So I was kind of curious, if you, did your people participate in buffalo jumps? Is there one around here that we could visit? And then I guess, have you ever researched, you know, more prehistoric, probably before 1600?
Yeah. Yeah, so well, there's one up in Havre behind a mall, a decrepit mall to begin with. That one's not that cool. There's one in Ulm, which is just south of, just south of Great Falls. The Ulm Pushkin buffalo jump. I highly recommend that. It's got like a mile-long cliff face that when they started excavating it, they found a bone bed 13 feet deep. So they know, I mean, how many countless thousands of buffalo were driven off that thing. Buffalo jumps were used primarily until we got horses. Once we got horses, we didn't have to do buffalo jumps anymore. So, you know, the tribal relationships then were different than they are now. Just because the horse changed so many things. But our TIPO, Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Dwayne Reed, he believes that Chippewa people were here for several thousand years and certainly participated in that. So depending on the tribe, you'll get different stories about their relationship with places like Ompishkin, but yeah, those were critical to our survival as buffalo hunters. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
I highly recommend going there. I
Yeah,
love that.
we're
They've got
excited
a
about it.
great visitor center. They sell my books, so they're the best.
Well, I guess maybe you could talk more about like your relationship with animals and, you know, grizzlies and buffalo, Montana wildlife.
Yeah, so, Anishinaabe culture, we have the 7 grandfather teachings, which is our kind of code for how you should live your life. And those 7 grandfather teachings, each have an animal associated with it, and that's what I have tattooed on my forearm. So our relationship to animals, they are our relatives, you know, and when I say Buju, Idinwe Muganaduk, hello, all my relatives, I'm speaking to you as human relatives. I consider everything my relative, animal, plant, whatever, because we are all in relationship. We all rely on each other for survival in the same way that we do just as people. So each one of these, and I will tell you, so this is Mickey, the bald eagle. I think Mick was a little mad that I would start Mickey there, so I threw my glasses off. Mickey, the bald eagle, is the representative of love. So love is one of the 7 grandfather teachings. Makwa, the bear, represents courage. Mick, the beaver, represents wisdom. Gagagi, the raven, represents honesty. Misquadasi, the turtle, represents truth. Maningun, the wolf, represents humility. And Bijiki, Mashkade Bijiki, the buffalo, represents respect. So we are a buffalo people. We are a buffalo culture, just like all the other plains on the northern plains, all the other tribes on the northern plains. Little Shell flag has a buffalo front and center because that is who our lives depended most on. So these animals are representatives of those philosophies, those teachings, because we used to live among them all the time. And that to me is a great way to kind of recognize how much has been lost. Because there aren't too many places where I can go now that I know of, where all 7 of them are still living together. So Yellowstone is a place where all 7 of them are. And Yellowstone, I think, is a great place of spiritual power, even for people who don't realize it. How many people go to Yellowstone and come away like, I never expected it, just blew me away. That is a sign of all of that power that has been there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Another place I go all the time that has all 7 is the Flathead Reservation, the Mission Valley and the Chouteau Valley. All 7 of them are there too. So that, you know, one of the stories I like to tell about, I mean, that's a great question about our relationship to animals. If you look at a map, pre-contact of North America, where do you see people? Everywhere. East, west, north, south, indigenous people live. Where did you see buffalo? Everywhere, coast to coast, north to south. Where do you see us now? Buffalo, if you look at a map, they're in little dots in the west, places like Yellowstone and the Bison Range and Theodore Roosevelt National Park, places like that, but just little dots on the map. Where do you see indigenous people? Little dots on the map out in the west. So now in this current era, I feel like I am benefiting. This book exists because there's a growing awareness of the importance of indigenous thinking, traditional ecological knowledge that comes from indigenous people, respect for indigenous art, and I feel this rising. People are starting to pay attention again. And my book is an example of that because no one would have wanted to publish this book 10 years ago because of the work other people have been doing to raise that awareness that gave me the opportunity to publish. Well, what's happening with buffalo, with bison? They're our national mammal now. People care about them. There's all kinds of conservation organizations doing everything they can to restore and return herds to places where they always were. All the reservations in Montana are building their own buffalo herds. We're even talking about it in the Little Shell. I think we better be. At least it's on the tribal council. So I know that we had 5. I think they ended up in the tribal freezers, but but that relationship, as we rise, they rise, as they rise, we rise. And there's nothing more succinct that I can say about our particularly Northern Plains indigenous relationship with animals than our relationship with the buffalo. Yes.
One person whose footprints can still be felt around Fort Benton is Louis Riel. As you look back on your background, what did you discover about any intersections that your forebears had? with them?
I found out that the great Gabriel Dumont, who was the male fist of Louis Riel, is a relative through marriage. He's like my great uncle or something like that. So, you know, Louis Riel, for those who don't know, is literally the most written about political figure in Canadian history, yet on this side of the border, hardly anybody knows who he is. And he led a couple rebellions in Canada in an effort to create a Métis homeland. The first one in the 1870s, he ended up exiled to Montana. He became an American citizen. He lived in Helena for a time. He lived in Fort Benton for a time. Ken, in his most recent book about Fort Benton's history, has a great chapter about Louis Riel in there. There's multiple books you can read about Louis Riel. But when he was in Lewistown in the early 1880s, he drafted a petition for a reservation in central Montana for the landless Indians. And both of my great-great-grandfathers signed that petition. I'm sure Elisa's parents signed that tradition, grandfather. And the military, the US Army commander of the region at the time, Nelson Miles, agreed with it and thought it should happen, but it never went to Congress because the agent for the Crow at the time, the Indian agent, shut it down. So we can't have that. The reason why is he thought the Crow were gonna get their reservation moved into that area, and he wanted to keep it for them. So there's all this politicking, as always, that kind of, you know, sunk the whole deal. But that was Louis Riel's doing. You know, Louis Riel and my mentor, the late great Nicholas Bruman, his belief was that Louis Riel came to Montana, recognizing it as a place like Manitoba, perhaps it could be a Métis homeland, and that reservation was kind of the first step in that direction. Yeah, so Louis has a strong presence in our community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, John Kastner, the founder of Belt, was writing about the first Christmas in 1877 in Belt. And he said nothing was going on except about a mile away in a canyon, there was a Métis camp and there was music and dancing going on.
Mhm.
How important was that in the Métis culture?
Yeah, Christmas, not so much as New Year's. So we would start about Christmas in preparation for the mayhem that would ensue in New Year's. So New Year's was and remains a very big deal. Like I got invited up to Lethbridge last year for their New Year's celebration. And what I loved about that is I walked into the room and there's all these people, and on the stage like this, they had a blue Métis flag and then a red Métis flag and then a little shell flag. And I was brought to tears. Doesn't take much to bring me to tears anyway, but that was pretty awesome that they made that gesture. So yeah, New Year's, it was kind of a big thing. And you know, as Catholics, of course, Christmas is probably more like the religious part. And then the baby making is New Year's.
But it was the fiddle music and the dancing,
Yeah.
but
And then shove all the, like if this was Métis, you'd eventually shut me up and then we'd shove all the furniture to the side and someone would pull out their fiddle or a couple of you and we'd start jig dancing right in here. That's just how we did things. Anything else? Yes.
So I think, as white European descendants, most of us are thinking that, I mean, the rise of recognizing how the importance of indigenous cultures. And we like to think that the era of genocide and settler colonialism is over. I just wonder if you'd like to speak to the situation in the Middle East and what's happening there and the relationship there.
Yeah, well, it's not even over here. You know, genocide isn't just a body count. You know, blood quantum rules for how we determine tribal enrollment is long game genocide. And that was handed to us by the federal government. And certainly it's just one of many ways the United States has tried to get us to eliminate ourselves, and it hasn't worked. So the vast majority of Indigenous North America is in absolute solidarity with the Palestinian people, because what happened to them is what happened to us. It's happening in Africa. It's happened all over the world, and it's happening all over the world. Whenever you have people who have power and money and access to political people who will pass what they want to maintain their wealth, that happens, and that's how it's always happened. And, you know, my personal position, yes, I'm in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and I don't even care what side, who you think is right, and who is wrong. Wiping people out for any reason is wrong. We need to stop the killing and then sit down like freaking grown-ups and work some of this stuff out. I cannot understand how anybody can justify any of that bloodshed. And it's unconscionable, and to argue otherwise, I just don't get it. It makes me angry. As someone, you know, who, as I like to describe it, we took the best shot the most powerful country in the world could deliver right on the chin in an effort to eliminate us, and we're still here. And I feel like locally, we have a responsibility to speak up for who we are and what we survived and what that means. And globally, we are a global community. We have a responsibility to stand up for that. And all too often in the United States, I feel like all anybody cares about is like our own little borders. And no, our reach is well beyond that. Thank you for asking. I get a little worked up. Any other questions? Yes.
How big is the Little Shell tribe? Coming from a small town, is the Little Shell similar, is it 1,000 people?
We're just under 7,000.
7,000,
We were at like 5,300 when we got our federal restoration,
okay.
and we're just under 7,000.
And is that the main Métis tribe, or is there multiple, places to enroll if you're Métis, or is it pretty much?
Well, so, you know, Métis aren't a tribe. Métis are a culture.
Okay,
So think of Ojibwe people. They're a culture who are represented in different tribes. So like the Little Shell are technically an Ojibwe tribe,
okay,
comprised of Ojibwe people and Métis people. And then you have the Turtle Mountain tribe of Chippewa Indians, who are also comprised of Chippewa, Métis, and probably Cree and Nakota, just like we are. You have, you know, White Earth and Red Lake. So you have cultures who come together to comprise the tribe.
okay.
And
So if you know someone who's Little Shell, you actually don't know much about them.
well, you know, they're like a top shelf.
They're the best.
Rest are all off, Randy. We're in. No, you know, we're banded together under this one tribe, but people can identify how they want. You know, I choose to identify as Métis or Anishinaabe. Anishinaabe being another example of something that's not a tribe, think of it as like an umbrella that multiple tribes exist under, related through language and culture. So, and Métis are one of them, Ojibwe are one of them. I like to identify as Anishinaabe because in Anishinaabe worldview, we believe everybody is Anishinaabe. So I can say I'm Anishinaabe, and we all come from the same place. So I can say I'm Anishinaabe, and that incorporates my mom's entirely European heritage into mine. And I double down on kind of the indigenous North American aspect of that cobbled together identity of where the various people come from, because this is the land I live in, this is the land that speaks to me, this is the Anishinaabe land. But does that make sense? I know it's kind of confusing. Like, we're all Montanans presumably in here, and we can identify as Montanans or Americans or however we want to, yet, you know, at the micro, we're all these other different things identifying as different ways. Yes.
So do you see the natives that way too? Like you talked about the Crow kind of pushing the Métis out back in the 1800s.
Oh, hey, whoa.
Politically.
That was the Indian agent. I'm being mildly facetious, yeah.
But was there much, you know, like that, like the Crows down here and Blackfeet are there, and, you know, there was more crossover too, wasn't there?
There absolutely was, and, you know, I Western historians have tried to, like, in America, we like to have things in neat little boxes. And I call that, you know, like how we learned our history, the zoo enclosure view of history. Like, imagine you're on a steamboat coming up to Missouri, and you've got a guy who's saying, On your left, we have the Crow Nation, while coming up here on our right is the Mandan, and if we get a little farther, look out for those Blackfeet people. You know, and yeah, we had our territories, but there was all kinds of overlap as well. And, you know, you knew when you were in somebody else's territory, but like where I live, you know, when we do our stupid land acknowledgements, we always acknowledge it as the traditional homeland of the Salish. And it's like, yeah, it was, unless there was a big camp of Blackfeet on the Clark Fork. And you're not gonna find anybody who's Salish around there at that time. Or if there's a big cart train of Red River carts coming through, it's not Salish territory at that moment either. So it's a little bit different. But yeah, there was all kinds of overlap. There was a lot of fighting and violence, but there was also a lot of trade, a lot of intermarriage. We recognized thousands of years ago that if you just married and had kids within your own little group, pretty soon you're gonna have people with like 3 heads and 4 feet. You know, so we incorporated other people from other communities into ours to keep ourselves strong. Which is what makes the whole idea of how we determine tribal enrollment now just asinine and about as non-traditional as you can be. Does that answer your question? Anybody else?
When you're in tribal enrollment, are some states different though, as far as like blood quantum or whatever it is?
It's not state determined, it's tribe determined.
It's tribe determined,
So like the Cherokee don't use blood quantum. And
okay?
as a result, they're the largest tribe and probably the most economically powerful in all of it. We do, I hope we change that. Some other tribes don't, but yeah, we're not obligated to. We were originally, you know, handed when the United States said, okay, you need to set up governments and you need to have a constitution, you know, and by the way, here's a plug and play boilerplate thing that you can use. Most tribes did that, and blood quantum was part of that.
Okay.
And that started in the 1887. I always want to say 1878, it's 1887. But the Dawes Act, which was the Allotment Act, which is when the United States went after tribal land and they determined, okay, how much Indian are you? And that's when the whole blood quantum thing started in an effort to take land, and it worked. You know, tribal, you know, reservations, if you have an idea that only Indians live on reservations, that's kind of true on the ones like the Blackfeet and Fort Peck that are way out in the middle of nowhere. But anywhere where there's like good land and things that you want to do things with, like the Flathead Reservation, there's way more non-tribal people living there than there are tribal people. And that's because of the Dawes Act, followed by the Homestead Act. So blood quantum became a way to say, okay, well, you're white enough to own land, so you get an allotment. And we could talk for an hour just about that.
So kind of talking about reparations and dealing with the reality that most of us non-native white Americans are living on native land, and that there's this tension between, like you said, if the United States were to recognize your culture or your tribe, then they have to recognize that they owe you a lot of things, including land. So what are some ways that non-native people can support reparations? Are there any like legislation
Yeah.
on the table currently that people can vote for? Or like, how could people be involved in the empowerment of the people?
Well, there's nothing official happening other than, you know, some initiatives, at least related to land. So there's this kind of amorphous, you know, hashtag land back that exists in the Native community. Land back is as much redefining or returning to our relationship with the land, not so much like, do you have a house? Can I have it? We're gonna move you all out of here.
Yeah.
It's not that. And people hear that and they freak out and they think that Indians want to remove everybody and take it all back. Same with like, critical race theory. If you think Indian Ed for All in your elementary schools, and your high schools, and your colleges have anything to do with critical race theory, you need to do a little education on what critical race theory actually is. There's a big difference between teaching the history of where we all live and some niche college course about critical race theory. They're apples and oranges. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to rant about that. But, there's all kinds of things that we would like to see happen, like co-management, say, of Yellowstone Park. I get all, like, when I was out on the East Coast, constantly driving through toll booths and stuff to get anywhere, I'm like, we should have tolls on every road leading into Glacier on the east side that the Blackfeet get. We should have tolls up 93 through the Flathead Reservation, because millions and millions and millions of dollars pass through those reservations on the way to these national parks that were taken from tribes, and the tribes don't get anything. I can get in for free with my tribal ID, but that's not feeding my people, So those kinds of things, and sadly, especially in the western states, like Montana, I don't expect our elected officials to all be as radically left as I am, but we're drifting so far to an elected, and I know for humanities things, I'm not supposed to talk politics, but I do what I want. We're going so far to representing just a tiny little stretch of our population. It's nothing like what it was when I was growing up in Montana. We were purple, and I'm proud to be purple, and now we're just getting away from that. And I don't feel like, with the exception of one person at the national level, that we have anybody who cares about Native people, except for the 6 weeks before an election, because we have a powerful voting bloc. But that bums me out. Vote, bring things back a little bit. That's about all we can do right now.
What do you think would help natives that have a reservation? Like, is there more drug control? Is there anything that you're aware of that would really help the natives and the whites living on the reservation?
Well,
Any ideas?
it's the same thing. There's a lot of drug problems in wealthy white communities too. We just don't hear about it.
Yeah.
So we like to say, oh, those poor natives, there's so many drugs. There's freaking drugs everywhere. But yes, but that's right.
Yes.
We don't care about each other. The fact that we don't have how many of us have really good health care if your job doesn't provide it? How many of us can afford to really even live in Montana anymore? If I wasn't already in the housing situation I was in 2015 and on, there's no way I could live in Missoula, even though I've lived there pretty much my whole life, because what's $500,000 is the median house price. Who can afford that? People coming from somewhere else. So we have all of these social programs that are non-existent, that would take care of us, that would give us health care, that would take our veterans in that are damaged because of post-traumatic stress disorder, or who get addicted while they're in service and they come back and nobody takes care of them. All of these things, if we made people healthy and treated their mental illnesses and treated their addictions, the cost for that and what the benefit would be to our communities, the balance would be totally flipped. We don't seem to care about each other, and that bums me out. At all levels, whether city, state, national. We're so far behind, we're supposedly the wealthiest country in the world, yet there are these countries that have nowhere near the wealth we have that actually take care of their people. They can't fathom the idea that your whole family can be bankrupt because you get in a car accident. It's not your fault, It's unconscionable. God, I'm getting all worked up. I had to speak, so in Missoula, we have the Poverello Center, which is the homeless center, and we had a celebration for the 50th anniversary of the existence of the Poverello Center. Critical work they do. And they asked me to speak because I'm poet laureate, and sometimes people think when the poet laureate shows up, they're gonna pull a string on his back and poetry's gonna. And I think the most important thing about art, poetry being art, is speaking truth to power. And I didn't say a single poem. It was like days after the city council had voted, despite an overwhelming community response against this new measure that was pushing houseless people out into these other areas. And I won't go into the details of it, but it was horrible. And city council members there at this celebration, and the mayor sitting like right where you are. And I said, you all like to do these land acknowledgements. You feel so good about yourselves. Does we all know what land acknowledgements are? Like the beginning of things when people say, we want to recognize that we're on the traditional land. I call land acknowledgements the liberal progressive version of thoughts and prayers. Because people say them and then they don't do anything about it. And I said, you know, you say, we want to steward this land like the Salish people have for, since time immemorial. And I said, you know, when the Salish lived here, what we didn't have, we didn't have one tribal member with 5 teepees and 10 people living out here with nothing. We didn't have one household full of food and half the tribe starving. If there was food, everybody ate it until it was gone. And then we got more. Those who could provided for those who couldn't. We do that still in little pockets occasionally in our own communities, but it doesn't last. So if people really want to acknowledge the way we lived on the land, those are the changes we need to make. Ah, geez. Who knew this is where Port Bend would go? All right. Any other questions? We've been going at it about an hour. There are books for sale. Not entirely anti-capitalist. Yes.
Just because of one of the questions that you got, I don't know if you have it on there, but if you have your Rodney Street poem, maybe that would be the way to end.
Oh, I do. Someone just pulled the string on my back. So I do have a poem. It's a Louis Riel poem. I think. Somebody have a fiddle or something while I look for this?
Looking for it, so I'll just tell you that if you did want to buy a book, we can take cards. You don't have to have that.
This is all planned.
What books do you have?
So this is essay collection that has an essay in, stories from the trail, and then we have his first book, One Sentence Journal. This won the 2018 Montana Book Award and 2019 High Plains Book Award. Then the second book is Descended from a Travel Worn Satchel. This is a collection of haiku and haiku poetry. And then, of course, Becoming a Little Shop.
And that's the one that deals with the history of the tribe.
Yeah, that's the one that he's been talking about. Yeah.
I just had this.
No,
Oh, let's get it.
sorry, I threw you off tonight.
Well, I didn't, yeah. I don't have an internet connection either, so.
You need to connect to the library internet. You can do that too.
Oh, here it is. So the Louis Riel lived at 203 North Rodney Street in Helena for a few years before he went to teach school at St. Peter's Missionary just up by Cascade. And it was there where the group of steely-eyed buffalo hunters came and asked him to come lead another rebellion in Canada, or for the Métis. It was the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. Even though he's an American citizen, when that battle and when that insurrection, whatever you want to call it, ended, he was hung for sedition, even though he was technically not beholden to the Queen of England anymore. So this is 203 North Rodney Street. In the shade across the street from where you stayed, Louis, a tipsy local with wild hair asks me what I'm doing, and I tell him the revolutionary Louis Riel lived here, that I'm in town and thought I'd come and pay my respects to the universe, that maybe some of your stardust might be stirred up with the rocks and grime of Rodney Street under renovation. And he says, wow, man. And then he says, hey, man, are you Mexican? And I say, no, I'm Métis. He says, you're what? And I say, I'm Métis, you know, Indigenous, Chippewa Cree. And he says, oh, I'm sorry, man. And I say, it's really no problem. I'm looking at the blue sky and reflecting how we are all related when the man still near me says, hey, do you have a cigarette or any spare change? And Louis, I think how dirt like this street poor you were. So I give him the $20 in my wallet. And now as I write, minutes later, here he comes, a cigarette in hand and a 6-pack in a plastic bag in the other. And I hope he cracks one open on this unseasonably warm day today for me and for you too. Thank you so much for all of you coming out tonight. I really did not expect this. And there was like 5 people here and then it was like a bus unloading. I love that. Thank you.